Well, hello there, and welcome back to our series of videos on the topic of molecular genetics. So in the last video, we learned about the structure of DNA, and we saw that DNA is made up of basic units called nucleotides, and nucleotides can be put together, joined together to form long chains called polynucleotides. And DNA is made up of two polynucleotide chains, with the sugar and phosphate backbone on the outside, and the bases stacked up in the middle. So we also saw that the sequence of these bases can vary. So for this example, maybe the sequence on this DNA molecule is A, G, T, C. And due to complementary base pairing, right, where there's hydrogen bonds between the bases, if we know the bases on one strand, we can immediately tell the base on the other strand. So if adenine is here, then the other strand would be thymine. If guanine is here, the other strand would be cytosine, and so on. Now, this sequence of nucleotides is very important for carrying genetic information. And we saw that segments of the DNA molecule are called genes, right? Segments which code for a particular protein or which determine certain traits are called genes. Now in this video, we're going to take a closer look at what is a gene, and we're going to take a closer look at how genes actually code for a polypeptide, how genes actually code for a particular trait. I mean, I can tell you that this gene gives you black hair color, but how does a message like AGTC become a black hair color? Now, how does the body convert, how does your cell convert this sort of message into a trait? That's what we're going to look at in the rest of this video. So what is a gene? Well, in the topic on inheritance, we defined a gene as the basic unit of inheritance. We say that a gene is the basic unit of inheritance that codes or that determines a certain trait, and it can be passed down to offspring. So that's at a sort of big organism level. But if we go down to the molecular level, we can define a gene in this way. And this definition is very important for you to remember and to understand. So a gene at the molecular level, so over here, a gene is a sequence of nucleotides or a segment of DNA that controls the production of a single polypeptide. So here is now in a diagram, you can see that the gene is a segment of the very long DNA molecule. It's just one segment. If we magnify that, you can see that it's actually a sequence of nucleotides. And this sequence of nucleotides can be used by the cell, can be interpreted by the cell to help control the production of polypeptides. Now, usually one gene will result in the production of one type of polypeptide. We'll see more of this later. Now, just a note that a DNA molecule can contain more than one gene along its length. So DNA molecule is very long, right? Every chromosome is one very long DNA molecule which can contain more than one gene along its length. Okay, so here's a different diagram of a gene. You can see that this is a very long DNA molecule, and one segment of it is a gene. And the gene is a sequence of nucleotides. You can see that here is a sequence of nucleotides. Now, every gene has a unique sequence. And this unique sequence carries that message. It contains the information needed to produce a specific polypeptide. It's a bit like your instruction manual. And this instruction manual will tell the body how to produce that polypeptide. So if I change this sequence, maybe through a gene mutation, right? Remember, a gene mutation is a change in the structure of a gene. So it's a change in the sequence. If this sequence is changed, then the instructions are changed. And then the polypeptide produced will also be changed and will be affected. Now, before I go on, I just want to recap with you what is a polypeptide. Now, remember that a polypeptide is actually a very long chain of amino acids, right? It's made up of amino acids. And several polypeptides can come together to form larger proteins. So this is in line with what we learned before, right? Proteins are made up of polypeptides. Polypeptides are made up of amino acids. So here are some examples of proteins or polypeptides. We have learned before about enzymes, so like pepsin in the stomach. We have learned before about hormones, insulin, produced by your pancreas, remember that? We've learned about structural proteins like collagen in your skin, and we've also learned about hemoglobin, right? That protein in our red blood cells that helps carry oxygen. Now, all of these are proteins which are made up of polypeptides. So there are genes that will help control the production of these things. There are genes that will help code for these things. So for example, there is a gene that will code for pepsin. And there's also a gene that will give the instructions for how to make insulin. And there's also a gene to give the instructions on how to make collagen. And then there will be another gene that gives the instructions on how to make hemoglobin. And all those genes will have different sequences so that they have specific instructions for each of the different polypeptides. Now, many, if not most of our characteristics are due to proteins. Proteins contribute to many of our characteristics. For example, let's imagine the characteristic of your hair being black. What does that have to do with proteins? Well, the fact that your hair is black might be due to the presence of an enzyme that produces black pigment. That means that in your body there's a gene, and the gene codes for this enzyme. So the gene is there, has the instructions to make this enzyme. So the enzyme is made, and then the enzyme makes black color pigment, which makes your hair black. And changes in genes may affect your body structure or function. So imagine if this enzyme, the gene that codes for this enzyme becomes mutated. Then your body doesn't make an enzyme that works anymore. So if no enzyme, then no black pigment, then your hair will no longer be black. It's a bit like this. Your genes are a bit like the instructions, the blueprint. And if I change the blueprint, then the resulting structure will look different. So any small change in your genes can actually lead to changes in your characteristics, because genes code for proteins and proteins contribute to a lot of your characteristics. So here's another example. Let's think of the example of melanin. So there is a gene in your body that gives the instructions that codes for an enzyme that produces melanin. So normally that gene will lead to the enzyme being produced, and then the enzyme will produce melanin so that you have skin color, right? Certain skin color. However, sometimes in some people, there's a mutation in that gene. So the enzyme for melanin is no longer produced. And in such individuals, melanin is not produced, and so they become albino. So here's a really clear example of how a gene, when it's mutated, will affect the characteristics of a person. Now, a second example would be hemoglobin, which is found in your red blood cells. Now, hemoglobin is a protein that is actually made up of 4 polypeptides. It's made up of 2 alpha polypeptides, these purple ones here in the diagram, 1, 2, and it's made up of 2 beta polypeptides, right? So 4 in total. Now, it turns out that there's a gene for this alpha polypeptide. The gene that gives the instructions for this alpha polypeptide is found on chromosome 16. The gene for this beta polypeptide is found on chromosome 11. Right? So you actually have 2 genes. Right? One gene makes the alpha polypeptide, one gene makes the beta polypeptide, so that together the polypeptides will come together to form hemoglobin. Now, sometimes there may be a mutation inside either one of these genes. So let's imagine that there's a mutation in the gene for beta polypeptide. Now, in such a person, they will be able to produce normal alpha polypeptide, but they will not be able to produce normal beta polypeptide. So that at the end of the day, the hemoglobin form is abnormal. And this is actually what happens in people with sickle cell anemia. They have a mutation in the beta polypeptide gene, and that's why the hemoglobin formed is different. It's hemoglobin S, right? And as a result, they have all sorts of disease symptoms. So again, a change in the gene can lead to change in a person's characteristics. Alright, so we've seen that genes give instructions or code for polypeptides. But how do they do that? I mean, a gene is just a sequence of nucleotides like A, G, T, C, etc. How does this sequence of nucleotides give instructions for making a polypeptide that's made up of amino acids? It's very, very strange. Now, we get a bit of a hint if we try to decode my message over here. Now, give you a hint, think about the alphabet. So this message here just seems like a series of numbers. It doesn't make sense. However, it actually says bio is awesome. Now, if you didn't get that, it's because you didn't think of the code. Now, here's the code. You can go back and try again in the previous slide. 1 stands for A, 2 stands for B, and so on, and 0 stands for space. So if I gave you this code, you would have been able to decode my series of numbers into a series of letters. Now here's the sequence of numbers again. Now the question is, why is this sequence of numbers important? Right? And the sequence of numbers is important because the sequence of numbers determines the sequence of letters. Right? So this 2 will stand for B, 9 stands for I, 15 stands for O, and so on. And if I change this sequence of numbers, then the message that results will change. The sequence of letters will change. So the sequence of numbers is important because it determines the sequence of letters. So how do genes code for polypeptides? Well, genes are made up of nucleotides, right? So genes are actually a sequence of nucleotides. A, C, T, A, C, whatever. And polypeptides are made up of amino acids. So polypeptides are actually a sequence of amino acids. So how do we go from nucleotides to amino acids? Well, the first key point is that the sequence of nucleotides in the gene, so the sequence of letters in the gene, actually determines the sequence of amino acids in the polypeptide that the gene codes for. That is to say that if you change the sequence of nucleotides here, then you will actually affect the sequence of amino acids here. So the order of nucleotides is very, very important to determine the order of amino acids in the polypeptides. This is a key point, and I didn't include it in your notes, so please write it down somewhere on page 5. I think there's a blank. Write it down there and make sure that you know it very well. Okay, so because of this, the sequence of nucleotides in the gene determines the sequence of amino acids. Because of this, what happens if you change the order of nucleotides in the gene? Well, if you change the order of nucleotides in the gene, then you will change the order of amino acids in the polypeptide, and hence a different or abnormal version of the polypeptide will be formed. That's what happens when your hemoglobin gene has a mutation. The order of nucleotides changes, and hence the polypeptide form changes, and hence the hemoglobin form is abnormal. So we know that the order of nucleotides helps to determine the order of amino acids. But how does that work? Well, we'll find out more in the next video.